Okay, we're live.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, Dawn. Hi, Facebook.
Hello, everyone. How are you?
I have to turn this off because otherwise I think it's going to, like, I can't watch us in two places. Hang on.
Having like an Inception moment?
Yes.
Is there a glitch in the Matrix?
I also think I'm going to have, if I don't shut some of this down, bandwidth issues because my kids got an Xbox. This is how we fill our time at home. So there's a lot of streaming happening on our network, which is not reliable to begin with. So
my kids have just been trading the Switch back and forth. We only have one Switch, but there's this game called Animal Crossing that is evidently taken over the world.
Okay. Yeah.
So they, and of course, they're teenagers, so they work it out with them among themselves. But there's been a lot of, hey, are you using it? Okay, no, I'll use it. Okay, well, here, you can have it now. And so there's a lot of Animal Crossing going on. And evidently you invite villagers or something. And my daughter has definite opinions on which villagers should be allowed and which villagers shouldn't. And
Mine are more into like shooting people, blowing things up, that sort of thing. So Animal Crossing sounds really nice.
As far as I know, it's non-violent. All I know is my daughter was telling my son not to talk to some of the villagers so they would leave. So, I mean, I guess that's how you handle things. I don't know. So
very good. Well, we do what we have to do during these strange times, I guess.
And you have exciting news for this week.
I do. I released a book yesterday officially. And it's honestly, it's been a weird launch because for anyone who doesn't know, I write as Delancey Stewart and I write very lighthearted rom-com. And it just, the world doesn't feel lighthearted rom-com-y right now, but I feel like that's even a better reason to have those kinds of books coming out. But it was just hard to be rah-rah and happy and excited about this launch because of what's going on all around us. So it's been a weird launch, but I do love the book. It's called Second Chance Spring, which you know because you developmental edited it.
I did, and it's very good and it's very funny. And it was a great break from dealing with the world.
Yeah, well, that's sort of what that entire series is meant to be. It's not, I mean, it is realistic. It's just silly.
It's kind of like a hot Hallmark movie. It's got some of the small town fun feelings of a Hallmark movie and then some really not Hallmark type love scenes. So that works for me.
Because I enjoy some cursing. And
some taxidermy, which is always what you want in your romances.
I don't feel like Hallmark does a lot of taxidermy related.
You know, it's really an untapped market for them. They should really check into that.
Anyway, yeah, it's a silly book and people seem to like it. So I guess all in all, things are going okay.
Yes, it's a very good book. And it was edited perfectly.
Of course it was. Well, so what are we talking about today, Dawn?
Today we are talking about not so great stories. Last week we talked about what makes a great story and some of our favorites. This week we're going to the other side of things that make not great. We're not going to say bad, but we're going to go with not so great stories.
And we're not going to talk about, I mean, we'll talk about things in books that make books not so great, but we're not going to talk about specific books the way that we did when we were talking about great books, because that would not be good or nice.
Yes. We're going to use movies. Movies are kind of free game. And there's a lot of easier things to pick out in the movies sometimes, because sometimes in the books, it's very, very tiny things. And then when you see it on screen, it just kind of glares at you. So we're going to go with that.
But I'm going to throw in a caveat. It turns out, am not a very critical movie watcher. I actually have known this about myself for a few years because my husband and I will go to see a movie and he's never satisfied. We'll come out and I'll be like, oh, that was great. And he'll be like, well, I mean, except like this was totally unbelievable. And then they did this. And could you even believe they did that? And I would be like, oh, I didn't even really think about that, but you're right. So I guess I turn off my critical brain in order to be entertained. And I don't do that when I read as much. So I may not have a lot to add here. I have opinions, though. I'll throw those in.
I can suspend disbelief. It's later when I start thinking about it that I'm like, oh, well, that would have never happened. And why did they do that? And so I guess I'm kind of the critical. I'm like your husband coming out of the movie going, well, this and this and this and this and this. We, a long time ago, my husband and I, when our children were very little, we got a rare date night that we left our kids with somebody and we got to go see a movie. And the movie was Transporter 2.
Mm-hmm.
I had never seen Transporter 1, so I have no frame of reference. But there was actually a part in the movie where the guy is driving a car that has a bomb under it. He drives to a junkyard, hits some kind of ramp, goes up into the air, some hook on a crane detaches the bomb, and then he lands safely and drives away.
Well, he probably planned that out very carefully ahead of time.
Absolutely. And I was kind of feeling bad because the whole, like, up until that point, I'd been going, this is ridiculous. And I like action movies, but I was still, this is too far. And as soon as the crane hit the bomb, and no lie, a guy in front of us stood up and went, ah, hell no. And I was like, okay, it's not just me. It's not me. Everybody knows. So.
Oh, well, I might have got that. I don't know.
You think that one you might have noticed?
Maybe.
So we're going to talk about, do you want to start with the characters of the plot, or where are we going to start?
Yeah, because even I can recognize an unrelatable character, right? So I think one of the things we kind of touched on last week was villains, mm-hmm. and how a lot of writers and probably people who make movies and TV shows are worried about making villains. They don't want them to be likable. They want them to be nice and villainy. And so they don't give them any relatable characteristics. They just make them evil. But did you ever watch that show Once Upon a Time?
Yes.
So the mayor was the evil witch. Like, remember, it was like half fairy tale, half real life.
Right.
And I thought that show did a pretty good job of making her relatable, even though she was evil. And so I think what we were kind of going to try to touch on is that characters don't have to be likable, because she really wasn't very likable. Right. But they do have to have some element of humanity that we can connect with.
Yes, there has to be something where, I think we mentioned this last week, of I wouldn't necessarily respond that way, but I can kind of see how this person or this character is responding that way. Their reactions have to make sense for who they are.
Right.
So that can also go the same way. If you have a villain that's like instantly redeemed and they kind of have the Grinch effect of the instant they see that things aren't as bad as they thought they were, then they're magically loved and magically everything's okay. That can be just as bad as having the villain who is so one-dimensional that they're just evil for the sake of evil.
Right. And the ones who, because that involves a lot of other characters, sometimes, when the villain is no longer villainous and all of a sudden everyone forgives them immediately and forgets that they killed, Uncle Bob and did that other horrible thing with the bomb. That is always kind of hard to buy too. So I guess believability is a second aspect that weaves into characterization. If you're going to have a character arc and your character is going to transform, that's great and that's necessary. But you have to remember that other people will reflect that transformation, and they may not always be like, oh, it's so wonderful to have you at Thanksgiving dinner after you killed my Uncle Bob last year. They may still carry resentment, even though the character has morphed, right?
Yes, absolutely. And there are characters that are very, I'm trying to think of the right word, I guess, polarizing. And there are always those characters that readers, or since we're talking about movies, viewers, really, the whole love to hate type thing.
Like, can you think of an example?
I should have written an example down.
For some reason, I'm thinking of Vampire Diaries, but I can't remember. What about like Buffy? Wasn't there? What isn't Spike?
Spike. Yes.
Polarizing character.
Well, and even if you go with something like Twilight with Edward,
Mm-hmm.
in the movies and with the book. Some people think it's this great romantic thing, and some people, I'm sorry, that noise you heard was my dog knocking something over. And then some people think he's a borderline stalker.
Yeah.
He sneaks in her room at night and stares at her while she's sleeping. That's not normal behavior.
Well, and 50 Shades of Grey, kind of same argument, right? The hero or the love interest, the male in that movie was also potentially not very romantic.
Right. So you got to kind of see it from other people's sides. And you also, especially our authors, you have to understand you're not going to make everybody happy.
That's critical to know.
They're not always going to like your characters. They're not always going to completely identify or relate with your characters. So it's important to, when you're writing about them, if you have one person be like, oh, I really just, I didn't like your heroine, I'm sorry. Okay. If you have 4 or 5 people saying she's horrible, then you need to rethink this and start trying to consider, okay, what is it about the character that's unlikable? What can I do to make them more relatable, and work through it that way?
Well, and sometimes it goes into that believability thing. It's not so much that the character isn't likable or relatable. It's that they're doing things that don't align with the character you've built. Yes. Where they're making choices that make your reader go, but there's no way you would do that because you already said this and this and this. So why would you do that? Right.
Well, and that is one thing, that is something that will immediately take me out of a story. If you have a character make a choice that is strictly for plot.
Yeah.
That you can tell the only reason they're doing that is because the author needs this to happen to make the next thing in the plot happen. And you don't get to cheat by having the character think something like, I don't know why I'm doing this.
Right. But that makes it all okay.
Right. If your character's like, I don't know why I'm going into this haunted house when I know that they told me the ghost of the witch of the lake lives in there. Okay, no, turn around.
You actually wouldn't do that.
No, you have to have some kind of motivation to be going into the haunted house. And so if you're going into the haunted house, it needs to be, I'm going into the haunted house where the witch of the lake lives because my little brother ran into the haunted house chasing our puppy and I must go save him.
Because otherwise you've got that classic horror movie, let's split up,
right.
mentality. Like, no, don't split up, you morons.
Well, and just in case I'm ever in some kind of horror situation with any of you, I will be the one attached to your back like a spider monkey.
The one going, we're not splitting up.
We're not splitting up. This is how you die. So yes, the character motivations need to be believable. Their actions need to be believable.
Sorry.
And the situation of the hook, the setup, everything needs to be based in some level of believability. Now, of course, I write fantasy. It doesn't, there's still rules to that world.
Well, and to a character. I mean, you still have humans or even fae or, high Valerians or whatever they are. And so you have the rules, you have to build a personality based on their society and then have them follow the rules.
And readers get very annoyed when the rules get broken just for the sake of the plot.
Yeah, for sure.
That's something they will lock into. Let me look at and then we have the contrived conflict.
Oh, that's big in romance, or at least it happens a lot with newer authors where the conflict is like, I thought he said this when we were 15. And so I've hated him ever since then. And even though we have to work together now, I still hate him because of that thing that he said. But other people say that maybe that's not what he said, but I know it is. So she could just be like, well what did you say?
Right, exactly. You do not at any point want the reader screaming at your book, sit down and have a conversation like adults.
Yeah.
And this even showed up. One of my all-time favorite, I will watch it anytime it's on, movies is Sleepless in Seattle. Mm-hmm. There's even the conflict there and there's a little bit of an argument of how Meg Ryan's slightly stalkerish in Sleepless in Seattle. Because she's kind of hunting down this guy, shared on the radio. But there's the scene where she goes to visit them, or actually, I guess she's showing up to actually talk to him for the first time. And she sees his sister get there and sees the sister hug him and hug the little boy. And then she's like, no, there was this woman there and all this kind of stuff. And it's
go
like,
all the way home instead of actually talking to him. Yeah.
Yes. And so it's back to, okay, you could talk to him. You could go up and say hello. And maybe he would be like, oh, this is my sister.
Right.
And that's something that's shown a lot in romantic comedies, in movies and in books, of a random person who's considered a threat shows up, and it's a relative or it's somebody's best friend who is there with their wife. And you don't ever want your conflict to be something that can be solved with a conversation.
Right. You don't want something that's easily explained away.
Yes.
Because then you get the whole too stupid to live criticism. Like, why would they not just talk about this?
Yes. And that phrase right there is something that you don't want on any part of your story. You don't want on your character. You don't want on your plot. You don't want on your conflict. Why would you not do this? And we've talked about, you and I have talked recently about the show Lock and Key.
Oh, yeah.
It's on Netflix right now.
Which I actually loved. I mean,
yes, it's a good show. It's a good show. And I don't do horror at all. And so for me, that was like the little bit of horror that I could handle. My kids laughed at me because there were so many things that happened that I like almost came out of my chair, and they're like, really, Mom, you didn't see that was gonna
oh, like the jump and stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
But there were also a lot of things where you're like, why would you do that? Right?
Yeah. We agreed we didn't want to give any spoilers on this, so I'm going to speak very vaguely for a minute. But one of the things that is not a spoiler is the fact that these children's dad has died.
Right.
And he dies very horribly. And the story picks up 3 months later where they've moved. There's no evidence they had any kind of counseling or any guidance to deal with the horrible way their dad died. For some very odd reason, the two older kids are starting school a week early before the younger kid.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that.
No, they just said, oh, you don't start school till next week. You're so happy. And then they leave.
And he's home alone in this really weird house a lot.
Yeah. He's completely alone. And the mom, who has just lost her husband in the past 3 months, and I'm sure had to rearrange her entire life, bringing her family to this really creepy house. Two older kids are off for their first day of school. The mom looks at the younger kid, who's supposed to be like 8 or 9.
Yeah.
And says, okay, I'm going to the hardware store, and just leaves him.
Enjoy our freaky old mansion.
Have fun with those ghosts. And so there were several moments like that. One of my biggest criticisms, and this is something that comes up in books as well, one of my biggest criticisms of it is they never know where these kids are. Nobody's ever paying attention to what the kids are doing, or if they're home, if they're not home. And Stranger Things does the same kind of feeling, but Stranger Things takes place in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I grew up in the 80s, and your parents didn't know where you were. You really did leave in the morning and come back when the streetlights came on and everybody went around on their bikes, and that was fine. We don't live in that world anymore.
Yeah. But you find that in a lot of YA novels too, where, I mean, in order for an exciting story to happen to younger people, you have to get rid of the parent figures, or they just bog everything down because they want to know what's going on. So there are a lot of contrived, or they just don't even bother. They just don't acknowledge the fact that probably mom would be wondering where they are right about now.
Right. Well, and there's easy ways you can fix that in a book. Like if I was working with Lock and Key, one of the suggestions I would make is there has to be a reason why mom leaves him there alone. There has to be a reason why mom has to go to the hardware store right then, and why she doesn't drag him with her.
Well, and I think it was almost there because I mean, as the story unfolds, you learn that she's struggling, and probably, I mean, for great reasons. She lost her husband in a really violent way. She moved her whole family across the country. She's got her own issues. So showing a little bit more of that would explain away a bit of her inattention.
Yes.
And maybe it was a comic book, wasn't it? So it's not like there was a lot of detailed narrative probably. But if it were a novel, I could imagine that would get approached a little bit more specifically. And maybe I would say it got lost in translation, except that there's probably more to the show than there was to the comic book.
Yes. And I'm willing to suspend the disbelief if you give me a reason. Mm-hmm. And so again, it's that whole, you don't want your reader or your viewer to be saying, why would they do that?
Yeah.
Or what are they doing? That's the other question that came up a lot in that show is, again, this isn't a spoiler. This little boy goes out and there is a well house that's like completely barred off and everything. So he immediately climbs through the bars.
Yeah.
And I get 9-year-old boy, they're exploring. I understand that. But it's the question of, okay, what are they doing? And that came up a lot with some of the stuff that the teenagers did that I don't want to get into because it's spoily. But yeah.
Yeah, that one, I even though I really did enjoy it, I was able to watch more critically. Maybe because I've seen it more recently and I'm getting better at picking things apart. I don't know if that's good or bad. Is that your influence on me?
Because you had me texting you going, oh my God, why did they just leave the kid alone?
Maybe. So what are some other things?
Oh, kind of going off of that is, and I didn't have my prop. I had one of my daughter's Monster High dolls that I was going to use. Oh. Is that you don't ever want Barbie characters. And I don't mean Barbie characters just like, there's the criticism of you don't want your character to be too perfect. You want them to be flawed, that kind of thing. But Barbie characters also, for me, are about back when we all used to play Barbies or G.I. Joes or whatever. And you got this character and they come over here and they're like, okay, I'm going to the store now. And the other guy's like, okay, I'll see you later. And then the girl wanders off. And you never know what's going on in their minds. You have no idea how they feel about something. Or if they were my Barbies, it was, okay, hi, nice to meet you. We should kiss. Yeah. But you don't know why she wanted to kiss Ken. I have no idea because there's a whole list of questions that come up in my childhood when I think about that. But you want to know their thoughts and their motivations and what is.
You've got talking heads on a stage, mm-hmm. and it's very hard to be invested if you don't understand why things are happening.
Well, and the reader wants to form an opinion. Mm-hmm. I want to form an opinion because I have opinions about everything. I want to form an opinion about, do I think you should be doing what you're doing right now?
Yeah.
And even if you're, for example, going into the scary house with the witch from the lake, which I don't know why the witch from the lake lives in the scary house, but she's got to get dry every now and then. That's where she kicks back. Right. But maybe that isn't what I would do. I would run and get help. But I want to form an opinion on, okay, I understand why you're chasing your little brother who's chasing the lost puppy into the house, which is why all of that motivation and stakes and all that has to come together.
Right. Well, and so luckily in books, readers can see what they're thinking. In movies, yes. They are at less of an advantage because they have to either show what they're thinking on their faces or say it out loud, right? So luckily we get to sort of narrate, and even though she knew that going into the house was a really bad idea,
Let me add to that real quick though. Even though she knew going into the house was a bad idea, she had to do it anyway because yes, she has to go save her little brother. Personal preference. What I hate being added onto that is if she knew what stepping into that house was going to cause, she would have never opened that door.
Because that takes away from the reader getting to figure stuff out. That's that evil foreshadowing that authors do sometimes that you just don't need. If you're going to write a good scene right after this one, don't ruin it for me by telling me what's going to happen. Exactly. I kind of already know. Like if you're doing a good job, there's a lot of tension when her hand is on that door. I am smart enough to figure out that whatever's about to happen is probably not going to be good for her. but let me
Yes.
like enjoy the tension while she pulls open the door, right?
Yes, which two of the other things on my list to talk about, one of them was tension, one of them is pacing, and we'll get back to the tension in a minute, which kind of goes with the pacing, because pacing is very, very important. I'm trying to think if I want to go with books or movies on this. One of the things you do not want to do is have the girl walking up to the door, her hands on the door, she's about to turn the knob, and then she thinks back to when her little brother was born and she was already 12, and then the day they brought Fido home and how excited. No, open the door.
Right.
Open the door.
Yes.
It's that record scratch of everything just stopped and I'm no longer scared of walking into the house now.
And in romance, it's the romantic tension. And I'll see a lot of times like a really good dialogue scene between the hero and the heroine, and things are getting, romantically tense. And then all of a sudden one of them is like off thinking about when they were a child and how they're, it just like it breaks the whole flow. And you're like, no, I don't want this right here. So I think being conscious of why you're putting a certain thing happening in a certain place is really important. And is that pulling the reader forward through the story? Think about it like, a conveyor belt that they're riding on, and think about which kinds of things keep it moving forward and what kinds of things are like, okay, now we're going to look over here and do this for a while. Okay, now we'll go back. And I don't know. I was just going to say, it seems when you're reading, you can easily identify when something like that is happening. I think it's harder when you're writing because you feel like, oh, but they have to know this.
Yes. And that's one of the questions that I end up putting in my comments very often for my clients. Is this something the reader needs to know right now to understand what's happening in the story?
Right.
And it's always harder, in my opinion, for new writers, because new writers feel like they have to tell the reader everything they ever needed to know right at that moment. And it's part of you want the reader to be able to form their own opinions, build their own questions, start feeling the tension of moving up to the door, all of that kind of thing.
Well, and just like in a movie, you don't want to show the end up front or, tell us what's going to happen. Why would we bother watching a movie? In a book, you don't want all the information on the first page. Like you want enough to start to feel grounded. And I know we weren't talking about beginnings, but my brain always goes there when we start talking about like info dumping. And we'll see a lot of times like all this explanation that is so not necessary, because all I want as a reader when I open a new book is to see what the story will be. Who are the people and what are they trying to do? And then you can tell me all the other stuff along the way. But what I want to know is like, okay, where are we? What is happening? Who is involved? And why do I care?
Exactly. And I saw a presenter at a conference one time who put it very well of when you first meet somebody, if they walk up to you and they say, hi, I'm Dawn. This happened to me when I was a child. And then this happened to me and I'm related to this person. And this is, you kind of start backing away from them slowly and don't want to continue conversation. And so that's kind of the same thing you see with the characters of you can introduce them slowly. Don't tell us their entire family history in the first 3 pages. Let us get to know them before they're dumping all their baggage on us.
Yeah. All right. What else?
Oh, so we talked about pacing and how you want to keep that moving and you want to keep the conveyor belt going forward and that kind of thing. And now I'm going to give completely contradictory advice and talk about tension.
Yeah.
Because often with tension, you've got to slow things down. And so back to I'm really attached to this haunted house today. So back to the haunted house, if the pacing would be have the girl run up to the haunted house and throw open the door and grab her brother. But to build the tension, you've got to have her coming up to the haunted house and noticing how it's falling apart and seeing the big hole in the deck and knowing that her brother could have fallen in there and putting her hand on the door and hearing a scream and turning it. And so you've got to slow it down a little bit.
But all of that stuff is like window dressing on what's already happening.
Yes.
It's not heading us into a totally different direction. Like she's not suddenly having thoughts about this cake that she had when she was a child, which has nothing to do with what's happening. This is all like adding to what's already going on.
Exactly. I love that. It's window dressing. It's making it all pretty.
Yeah. It's just slowing the conveyor belt down a little bit. Like when
so you can actually see what's on it instead of moving it.
Yeah. It's when the car crash happens in slow motion in the action movie instead of, the way it really happens.
Yes. All right. Let me look at my list here again. Let's see.
You have randomness.
Oh, yes. That is, and this is where I get really annoying in movies, because that is when something just shows up to either solve a problem or create a problem.
Right.
And sometimes in movies, it's a little bit harder to get by, and sometimes it's not quite as bad because you might see a character shown in the background, like, oh, he was walking through that crowd, and somebody looks at them for a second, and then later they're an issue. Yeah. It's a lot harder in books to get away with that, because if you mention somebody in the crowd, I'm going to immediately start paying attention to them. And the example... And apologies in advance to anybody who this is their favorite movie. But a while back, my son and I watched Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets.
Never heard of it.
And there's a very good reason for that. And I don't feel that anyone should waste any amount of their life on it. And I think Rihanna's in it and shows up like as an octopus queen or something. And I'm not kidding. I should have looked that part up. My only memory of watching this movie, other than being completely confused the entire time, is at one point I had to look at my child and say, where the hell did Sam Elliott come from? Because this character had randomly shown up, and it was Sam Elliott, and I'm a Sam Elliott fan, so I am all for Sam. If Sam Elliott wants to pop up at my door right now, I am letting him in. I don't care anything about this quarantine. So I like Sam Elliott, but my thought was, I have no idea why you're here. I don't know how you got here, and I don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And he showed up for a little bit, did a couple of things, caused a couple of things to happen, and then he's just gone.
So he was there for the sake of the plot to make something happen?
To what extent there was a plot, yes. I mean, and that happens in books where mysteries and thrillers can be really guilty of this, of 3/4 the way through, random person shows up who has this magic clue that's going to solve everything. Mm-hmm. Or they happen to find something. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all for the working out the puzzle and, oh, we have to go here because we have to find this. But like something just drops out of the sky and they're like, oh, the piece I've been waiting for that will solve all of our problems.
Yeah, the convenient solution.
Yes.
And that does happen in romance too.
Yes. And that's where, I remember back in the 80s, like sitcom days, of where they would have the whole episode. Like I remember I think it was a Saturday Night Live skit that was about an episode of Family Ties. So that just tells you exactly how old I am.
I was right there with that.
But there was this whole episode about how they were going to have to move, and everybody was making all these decisions about what they were going to have to move, and they've lived in this house their whole life, and things are going to change. And at the very end, they get a phone call, and the dad's like, we don't have to move anymore. And that's just, it can't be solved that easily.
Right.
Because the reader feels cheated. If I went through this entire experience with you and all of a sudden a phone call solves everything without any cost or without any aftermath.
Yeah. Did you remove the stakes?
Yes.
There was no point in having any.
Right.
Nobody knew
anything. That was another thing that was on my list of your stakes. What is at risk? What is your reader going to, or your reader? No. What is your character going to gain or going to lose?
Right.
Those have to be defined, first of all. I need to know what we're risking here. And they have to be worth it.
Do they have to risk something in every story?
I think you risk something. It doesn't have to be something big. But people risk something every day. And so there has to be something at stake that you could lose or gain. And so
what's a good example of stakes?
A good example would be,
not to put you on the spot.
Let me think. I was going to try to use one from your book, but I won't.
That would actually be really helpful for me, because I'm like, I think I do that without necessarily knowing exactly what I'm doing.
Right. And I think sometimes it's a natural feeling. And then sometimes I work with clients that I very much have to say, okay, why is this important?
Yeah.
And so if you have a story where, for example, your main character is a baker and they have decided that they are going to win the county bake-off trophy. Why?
Yeah. What happens if they don't win?
Right. Exactly. What happens if they don't win? What happens if they do win?
Right.
What happens if they enter and then they get second?
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of won, they kind of didn't. So, and it needs to be, for one thing, the reader needs to know if they won or lost. There needs to be a way that, because how can I root for somebody if I have no way to tell when they actually win?
Right.
And in romance, when we deal with romance books, that's usually a lot easier.
Yeah. It's obvious.
Did they get the other person or did they not? But there's also normally an external. Yes, every time, or it's not a romance. That's a whole other video for us to do. But there's also the external of what are they working towards? Everybody's working towards something. Even if it's just, I'm working to make it until 5:00 today so I can sit down and have a glass of wine. Everybody has their goal. Right. If you've seen, what is the name of it? Zombieland. Mm-hmm. Woody Harrelson's goal is, dude wants a Twinkie. That is all he wants in the world, is he wants a Twinkie. And, some days, same, I can feel you on that. So he's working towards some kind of goal. And that's what you want your characters. That's what you want to see in the characters, is what are they aiming for? How are we going to know if they don't get it? And is it worth what they're doing? Right.
So a lot of those movies like Zombieland, I think, really lack that, because there's a lot of shooting up, and I don't mean with drugs. I mean, like, shooting people and exploding things. And the stakes are sometimes easy to figure out. Like in Zombieland, they're going to die if they don't kill the zombies. But the motivation is sometimes harder to get to the heart of. Like, certainly I don't want to die, so my motivation is to kill zombies to save my life. But the bigger picture, there's often nothing there.
Yes.
It's about killing zombies and not dying.
Well, and we can even, let's go back to My Haunted House. If we've got the girl running up to get her little brother, what happens if she doesn't run into the house? What happens if little brother chases the puppy into the house and the girl goes home and is like, yo, dad, big scary house on the end of the block there. You need to go get your son.
Right.
Take some holy water. I mean, so you've got to have those stakes set up to show, again, it all goes back to the character's motivations. What is driving them? What are they going to win? What are they going to lose?
Exactly.
And
all right. Have we pretty much gotten through it? Because we're close to 40 minutes here.
Can we do one more quick thing?
Mm-hmm.
Biggest thing, and we don't have this problem in romance because we just brought it up. You have to have a satisfying ending.
Oh, yeah.
Even in trilogies, even in, if it's not a romance, we know what our satisfying ending is going to be. It has to be earned, and it has to be a satisfying ending. For example, and this is one that my husband, who can hear me talking right now, would argue with me about, the movie Castaway.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That was a long movie.
Okay, you want to talk about some pacing? We can talk about some pacing there. The ending of that movie was completely unsatisfying for me.
I don't even remember.
Well, the movie's like 20-something years old at this point, so I don't feel bad spoiling it. He gets off the island. Mm-hmm. He has the package that he took with him the whole time, or that he held with him the whole time, that was like his inspiration for, I've got to deliver this package. He delivers it, but nobody's home. He drives to the end of the street, and a car passes him that I think has like the same symbol on it the package had, something that indicates that they're going to where he was. And he looks this way, and he looks that way, and the movie ends.
What? You never know what's in the box?
You don't know what's in the box. You don't know if he turned around. You don't, yes. So you need a satisfying ending. It does not have to be the ending that you think your readers would necessarily want. There is a book, it's a very old book at this point, called The Chocolate War by Robert Cormier, that it's a YA book. It's an excellent book. It does not have the hero winning at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And he was highly criticized when that first came out. And his statement on it was, children will understand it. They will understand why it ended the way it did. And you did. I remember reading as a teenager and understanding that that's the way it had to end. It wasn't the way I wanted it to end. Of course I wanted him to succeed. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be have to end the way the reader wants or the viewer wants it, but it has to end in a way that they don't feel cheated.
Yeah.
So, and I will wrap it up with that.
Yeah, depending on if it's a super short book, maybe it's less important, but like a really long book or a really long movie, you're investing a lot in sticking with that story. So
you do not want your reader to be texting their friends saying, I stayed up until 3:00 in the morning reading this book and this is how it ended.
Yeah. Yeah, that would not be good.
Because we'll do that when we're mad.
We will. All right. Well, I think we've gotten a lot of stuff in here of not to do's. Yeah.
Yes.
So what are we've covered great stories. We've covered not as great stories. What are we talking about next week?
Next week, we are talking about plotting versus pantsing.
Oh, I know you're excited about this because you said it absolutely has to happen.
Yes. We're talking about writing stuff. It's a law. You have to have that debate. And I won't give away any of our opinions on it, but I'm excited about that.
Okay.
And then looking forward, we have a couple of options, exciting things that might happen. We're trying to get some guests on. So we are saying that this schedule is subject to change if we get some of the guests that we want. Two of the topics that we're looking at covering soon is going to be writing myths of writing advice that we're told over and over and over that may or may not be effective. And with that, we're going to talk about setting some realistic expectations.
For ourselves as writers, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Setting the expectation of, for example, little hint, NaNoWriMo.
Yeah.
Setting the expectation of, can you write 50,000 words in a month? Should you? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And how to set realistic deadlines with your life and everything else that's going on in the world.
I think we could tack a little bit onto that one too, Dawn, with some resources that we might suggest, because there have been a couple things lately that I've discovered, which you totally know about, but I don't want to spoiler it today, that have helped me kind of recage my brain around thinking about my own process and what I need to be doing, that I think are pretty helpful.
Yes, that would be exciting. And then one of the other things that we have that I think is going to be a lot of fun is tropes and cliches. We see a lot of that. You're going to get to see a couple of my editor pet peeves come out there, because I don't have any tropes that I particularly have strong feelings about one way or the other. I kind of like all of them.
Yeah.
There are certain cliches that pop up, especially in romance writing.
Yeah. Oh, we'll have lots of examples, I think.
We will have lots of examples of, and that I think it would make your writing more fresh and interesting if you didn't include these things.
Yeah. Okay. That one I got.
So that's what we have coming up.
And then I think we're going to look at having some guests.
Yes.
Yes. So
yes.
Very exciting. We won't name names yet because we haven't talked to them, but we will.
Well, and we have talked to some of them. We just got to work out some scheduling things.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm very excited about having guests.
Well, it was fun talking to you today. You know what? I just pulled up the little comment section. So Stephanie Miller has been with us, and she agrees She agrees about Lock and Key. She says, I couldn't get into that show for the same reasons. It drove me crazy. The mom is clueless.
Right?
Yeah. Exactly. All right.
Well, thank you for joining us, Stephanie.
Yes, thank you. And everyone else, thanks for hanging in there. And hopefully these are valuable. We'd love comments, suggestions, questions, whatever you got. So we'll see you next time.
Bye.